If you just look around, humans are pretty flimsy creatures, right? We don't have like claws or sharp teeth. We can't fly away from predators, or we don't have camouflage or poison or any of the other things that like are critical for survival. What we have that's critical for survival is fitting in and working together.
Jay, welcome to 12 Geniuses.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have this conversation. Let's just start out with your background. Can you describe your career background?
Yeah, so presently I'm a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and connected to business school at New York University. And between graduating from my undergrad degree and going to graduate school, I worked for a year in government and also for a year at an organization that educated kids about racism. So I've done a number of things, and now my main job is just being a scientist.
Fantastic. And you co-wrote the book, The Power of Us, with Dr. Dominic Packer. It explores the usefulness and challenges of group identity. How are our group identities different from our individual identities?
Yeah, the way I think of it is like this. People have a sense of their individual identity. I think a lot of us walk around the world thinking, like we're the hero in a story. We have all the chapters of our life, like the ones I just told you, and you're overcoming challenges and trying to be successful. But the point we try to make in our book is that our identities go much beyond that. In fact, most of us have more inclusive identities that connect to, for me, I'm interviewing you right now as an author, or, when I get off this call, I'm back to being a scientist, analyzing some data. I also have when the day's over, I'm a father. I go home and like get my kids and have to make dinner. And then all of a sudden, all the other stuff doesn't matter. And then tonight, as I was just telling you, at 8:30 p.m., the Edmonton Oilers hockey game comes on and they're in the playoffs, and that's all I'll be thinking about. And so each of those are different identities I have. And through the day, the situations that we're in activate different identities. And so you go from yourself as an individual to all of these identities you have that are more inclusive than you, and that determine the roles and responsibilities you have, the ways that you think of the world. And so in our book, we make the case that our identities are very much like glasses. So I have my glasses on now. It changes a little bit how I see the world. If I go out tonight, I'll put on some sunglasses if it's still bright out. And that also changes a tint about how I interpret the world. And that's what our identities do. And a lot of them, for most people, if you ask them about, I am a blank, half of the things they answer are usually about group level identities that they have.
Well, I did that exercise.
Oh, how'd you do?
I mean, it's interesting because you said that you can come up with a bunch of identities pretty quickly. And I think I got 10 really quickly. And then I had to think about it. And I started with nouns mostly. I'm a father, I'm a learner, I'm a traveler. And then I started to get into adjectives and other words. So I'm comfortable, I'm optimistic, I'm a son. But I focused mainly on my individual identity and not on group identity. And so we're going to talk a lot about group identity in this conversation because this is part of a series we're doing on the 2024 US election. And I wanted to ask you, how do our group identities shape our individual identities?
Yeah. So when you identify as a group, it changes how you think about the world, but also changes your behavior towards others. And so one of the classic studies on this that we mentioned in our book is a study on generosity. So they brought people into a lab and gave them some money, and they had to decide how much they were going to share with other students at the university. And most people, if you're they measured beforehand if you were a selfish or generous person. And generous people gave more money, like Mother Teresa, she's always giving. So some people are just dispositionally selfless. Other people are more dispositionally selfish and they take more. And many studies in economics have measured this and studied this over time. There's lots of measures of it. But then they had another condition in the study where instead of having you think about yourself as an individual, they had you think of yourself as a member of that university. And so they activated this more inclusive identity you had in that community. For me, this might be like someone at New York University at NYU. And in that condition, the selfless people were still selfless in giving money to the other students. But what was most interesting is the selfish people doubled their selflessness, doubled their giving. So even self-interested individuals, once you activate their identity that's more inclusive as a member of that community, as a member of that group, they double the amount they share with other members of that community. And so suddenly their sense of identity is shifted up a level from me to us. And when they see themselves that way, they want the best for everybody who's connected to that identity. They start to see themselves more inclusively. So that's the ways that identities can affect our, these group identities can shape our individual identities, that our goals get expanded to include other people who are part of that identity.
I just wonder how that behavior, so generosity toward a group that I belong to, but what about behaviors toward others? Meaning, I know you went to the Ohio State University, and so probably the Michigan Wolverines are not among your favorite people. No. And so might my generosity toward a fellow Buckeye also mean that I might be a little bit more rude to a Wolverine or somebody from the University of Michigan? I just wonder what the opposite side of that coin is.
Though that's one of the fiercest rivalries in the entire country in sports. That was part of what it means to be, a good Ohio State fan, is that you hate Michigan with a passion, and the feeling is mutual. And so that's part of a lot of identities, is they have rivalries, and these rivalries fire us up. They help clarify who we are and what we stand for. Sometimes they can bring out the best in us. Other times they can bring out the worst, depending on the situation.
You write that we're wired for social identity. What do you mean by that? And what do we do with this information?
Yeah, so the way I think of it is in a really deep evolutionary lens. So humans evolved in small groups on the African savanna. And if you just look around, humans are pretty flimsy creatures, right? We don't have claws or sharp teeth. We can't fly away from predators, or we don't have camouflage or poison or any of the other things that are critical for survival. What we have that's critical for survival is fitting in and working together. Humans can communicate more efficiently and effectively than any other species on Earth. The other things we do is we cooperate with in-group members, even if we don't know who they are. No other primate does that. And so our evolutionary capacity for success, the thing that's put us on the moon and around the world, are those skills, social skills. This is one reason I like to point out, if you ask people what is their single greatest fear, surveys find that it's public speaking. They fear public speaking more than death. And it's easy to understand why, if you've ever given a public speech, is it's very stressful because you don't want to mess up and embarrass yourself and then be excluded, because social exclusion is extremely distressing. And so you and I and everybody listening is the offspring of generation after generation after generation after generation after generation of people who fit in. People who managed not to get excluded, because if they were excluded, in past generations, they just died. They couldn't reproduce. They couldn't get enough food for themselves. They couldn't defend themselves from predators. And so we are the offspring of people. Our DNA, our programming is to connect with others and work together.
How do group identities shape our beliefs? And I'm wondering if you can compare our group identities to family and maybe family or school.
Yeah, I think that we have lots of different identities. A big part of how we come to understand things is through our communities, that we trust some people more than others. We trust some news sources more than others, some podcasters more than others. And a lot of times we don't have the capacity to analyze all the data. So if we're going to talk about something, I got in an argument with an old high school teacher of mine online about climate change. He was a climate change denialist and posted something, and I got in a back and forth. And then I tried to read some article that he had posted on it from climate change scientists. And I realized, even though I have a PhD, I could not understand it. And I realized how much my beliefs about that issue come from my trust in the scientific process and scientific community and what climate scientists believe. And so all of us ultimately rely on that, in the same way that if my car breaks down, I want to go to a mechanic and I put my faith in that person to fix it because they know it better than I do. And again, that's one of our advantages of humans. We can work together and take advantage of other people's knowledge and expertise, but can also lead us astray. If we're listening to untrustworthy people, we can come to very bad conclusions. And sometimes we're motivated to not pay attention to things that challenge our beliefs because it's threatening, or challenge our group because it makes us look bad or feel bad. And so that is a risk that we run as humans. You have to understand, sometimes when people believe misinformation or conspiracy theories, A big part of the reason is because they've lost trust in other sources of information, and they've kind of gone off and down a rabbit hole where they're listening to increasingly untrustworthy sources of information, and they've placed their trust in those communities.
We've seen this political polarization play out over the last decade, certainly, and probably even longer. And I think back to 2001 after 9/11, this country was really unified in a way that I can't remember as an adult. And then just somehow that went away. But I've been thinking about this idea of religion and politics and how politics has seemed to become our new religion. I think about 2% of Americans were unaffiliated with a religion back in the 1950s, and now it's about 1 in 5 people, so about 20%. And weekly attendance of religious ceremonies has dropped from 42% to 30%. And it seems like politics has played a larger role in our identity. And I just wonder if you agree with this assessment, if you have anything that you wanted to share related to politics maybe taking over religion as an important group identity.
Yeah, I mean, the first layer of this is just that our religions often determine our politics, that different religious communities are connected to different political parties, not just here, but in many other countries. So that's the first layer of it. And then the second layer, as you said, is there's been changes in religion. We've become less religious. And because we're a groupish species, if you go back to that core premise, people are going to look for other communities to scratch that itch. And so I agree with you. I think one of the things that's happened is as religion has waned, people have clung to their political identities more and more to provide that sense of meaning, a sense of community, a sense of morality and right and wrong. And so I wrote a paper a couple of years ago with some political scientists, and we decided that we might be better calling what's going on in the US, instead of polarization, calling it political sectarianism. And in other countries where you have sectarian conflicts are often connected to religion because they go beyond just, I disagree with you on these policy issues, to you are an evil person and you must be stopped. And so that is a little bit more of the dynamic you see increasingly in American politics. The amount that people love their political party, Democrats or Republicans, has stayed stable over the last 40 years, 50 years. But the amount that they hate the other party has steadily gone up. And in fact, that is now stronger than the in-group love part of politics. And what it means is you will support a politician, even if you don't like them that much, because you need to stop the other party because you think they're going to do something sinister. And that's where you get corrosive politics, because you'll look past things like corruption or bad behavior of your own party. You'll rationalize it, justify it, vote for it. And so that becomes a dangerous thing for democracy. Another thing it does that's dangerous is it means that you won't cooperate with the other group, even if it would be in everybody's best interest. And so ultimately, the goal of politicians is supposed to be like being pragmatic and finding some way to work together so that the population benefits, the voters across the country benefit. But if you hate the other party so much or don't want to be seen working with them, then that means that even if you could find some grounds for agreement that would be popular, that the average citizen would like, you'll be reluctant to do it. And so that's another dynamic that makes it hard to have healthy governance and effective policy that would benefit most Americans or most members of any country. And that becomes a really dysfunctional system.
So what's playing out in our brains when we have this reluctance? Is it saying that our beliefs are wrong and therefore we're wrong, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts of it. The first part is just that you genuinely disagree with people. So like, let's say we're debating abortion rights, reproductive rights. There's going to be genuine disagreement on moral values. That's probably not possible to find a compromise for a lot of people. But then that's going to have to be fought out by, mobilizing people to get to vote and so forth. And putting pressure on politicians. That is normal part of politics. What's not normal part of politics is when we are rationalizing bad perspectives, when we're closing our mind to people who disagree with us, when we could learn something that would be useful. when we're socially ostracizing people who cooperate with, other political parties, even if it would be in everybody's best interest to do so. And so those are a lot of like different psychological processes that are going on. Some of it is rationalization. You're using your prefrontal cortex to rationalize your perspective. Some of it is emotional. Parts of your brain that are involved in emotion just get triggered when you see a member of another party. And these types of things can lead us down bad pathways, obviously. And I think this is what has happened again in American politics that makes it so dysfunctional, is that, you can drop our exact same brains into a political system that's less polarized, and we won't have nearly as much animosity. But when we're in a culture where you log onto social media and most of what you see is just flame throwing at people, or you tune into like partisan mainstream media and you just see constant attacks on members of your own political party or community, that's going to be outraging to people and lead them to disengage and distrust those sources of information. So that's a little bit what's happening. Is, again, it's this primitive brain that in a different environment, a different situation, there could be some sense of unity or like a healthy disagreement about things, but yet nevertheless a willingness to find common ground. But instead, what you've dropped all of the evolutionarily old brains into a system where there's intense animosity. And you could drop us into any system like that. You could drop somebody into the Middle East right now, and it's going to elicit the same type of us versus them mentality. You could have dropped them into Northern Ireland, 30, 40 years ago, and it would have done the same thing. And so this is something that is not new. It's been seen all over the world in all kinds of different political systems throughout history. And we've seen the destructive force of it many, many times over. And so that's why, I feel like as a scientist, I want to reach out and communicate this to people so they're mindful that they don't go down this rabbit hole, because I do think it's dangerous for us.
I think in the book you said something like 75% of people wouldn't date across party lines or something ridiculous like that. But that has seemed to supplant this, religious difference or racial difference or ethnicity difference.
Yeah. I mean, in America, the majority of Americans for most of the last century opposed interracial marriage, right, and many opposed interreligious marriage. Now they oppose inter-party marriage way more. And really, people strongly don't want to date or marry someone who's from the opposite political party. They don't want their kids to do it because that's also seen as sacrosanct. Again, it has that religious element to it. And so that is one of the biggest predictors. In fact, there's entire websites dedicated. If you're a Trump supporter, you can just find other Trump supporters on a website dedicated for Trump supporters. And so and of course, there's all kinds of other dating websites dedicated to this. If you're a vegetarian, there's like a vegetarian dating website. But now, the technology takes this instinct, which has like really been on steroids now for many years, and it just allows us to efficiently weed all those people out of our life. And again, there's research showing people are moving more and more towards counties and neighborhoods where people are politically like them. And it increasingly just cuts you off from perspectives that are different than yours. And that means we're not going to interact with them. And guess what? The less we interact with them, the less we'll learn that they're actually more nuanced in their thinking and have less animosity towards us and don't actually fit our very caricatured stereotypes. And so that is, again, it's kind of like a vicious spiral. We're running studies now where we're getting people from different political parties to tell their positions on all kinds of issues, from Gaza and Israel to abortion to immigration to marijuana laws. And what we find is actually there's incredible diversity. You'll find Republicans who have really nuanced views about women's reproductive rights, and you'll find Democrats who privately have really nuanced views about border security and immigration, illegal immigration. And most people aren't aware that a lot of other people who differ than them actually hold similar views to them on many other issues. And so that's something that, unfortunately, our politics and media and social media kind of continually feed us a version that doesn't really match reality. And it's really dehumanizing because it shows a sliver of us and it doesn't represent our full humanity. The most extreme people are driving this conversation and holding up other extremists as if they're representative. And so we walk around with a boogeyman version of people who are different than us that is way more exaggerated and hateful than that those people actually are.
When you understand that you value the same things that I do, and maybe the way that you demonstrate how you value those things is different, but that's a starting point, right? And I find that so interesting. Well, family is going to be an important value for most people, but when you understand that that's an important value, it transcends most of these different differences.
Yeah.
Then we can have a conversation about that. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, how do we overcome this? How do we overcome these differences? That's one way that I've started to do it, is leading with conversations around what people value, and then tell me about that, because I'm sure we can find common ground here.
Yeah, so you're getting close to what we just did. We just ran this study. It was run by Jan Volkner and Rob Willer ran this study out of Stanford University, and they challenged researchers around the world to come up with the best interventions they could to reduce this partisan animosity and increase support for democracy and so forth. And 252 teams submitted a proposed intervention. Again, from around the world. And this was not just scientists, but practitioners and people at think tanks and so forth. And then they had a panel of experts, political scientists, pick what they thought were the 25 best interventions. And then they tested them on 32,000 Americans. And my lab saw this, and we said, let's create one based on my book. So we created an intervention based on the principles in our book, which you've touched on already, we've been talking about. And, creating a shared identity, something in common, and then underscoring that there are shared values as well, and norms of commitment to democracy. And we created a short, 5-minute intervention in our lab. And then we sent it to them as one of the top 25. And I remember being horrified that it was not going to work or do very badly. And then there goes the whole point of spending 2 years writing a book. But we got the results back. I was super excited. It was the third best out of all 25, out of 252 interventions. The second best was revealing to people that the media was misportraying them. And so if you get a sense that people understand that your group is being misrepresented or misportrayed in the media, that kind of takes your guard down, because people really have the sense that they're being creating a caricature of them, and that other people see them through that lens, and they don't like that. Conservatives don't want to be seen through that stereotype, and neither do Democrats. And then the one that was best was actually just a Heineken commercial. I don't know if you ever saw this. The theory behind it is it's classic in social psychology. It's called contact theory. And the video, it was a short commercial by Heineken, and it just showed two random people coming into a room, and they just got instructions. And they slowly were building something. They didn't know what it was. And over, some time they built a bar. And then they sat them down at the bar when it was done. And all of a sudden they put a video up that each individual of the two individuals who built the bar, about what their political perspectives were before they had come in to build the bar. And they were different. Almost everyone was like a conservative and a liberal. And they showed the videos, and they just stood there in silence watching these videos of their political perspectives and how different they were. And then they put a beer on the bar, 2 beers, and they said, would you be willing to stick around and talk about your political differences over a beer? And of course, I don't know how much they edited this, but everybody's like, sure. And they showed them kind of starting a real, genuine conversation. And that was really powerful, because it shows real, genuine interpersonal relationships and positive contact can make people open-minded to kind of bridging their divides, or at least understanding other people in greater depth with greater empathy. So that to me is the best strategy. So it's the best 3 if you can use 3 things. Yeah, and you can download the paper from the Stanford Strengthening Democracy website if you want to read it.
I wanted to ask you, how do we broaden our common identity to, let's say, instead of Democrat or Republican, I'm an American, or I'm a human. And being able to identify at a broader level to that. How do we do it?
Yeah, so I think part of it is underscoring that you do share a common identity, and that comes with a set of values and norms and a history, and also opportunities to make it better. No identity is fixed. So I think that is the biggest thing. And then also, underscoring the accomplishments of that group. America, I think back, one of the best ways that Americans built a common identity was during the space race. It was obviously during the Cold War with Russia, and there were like national security elements, but it was also about like scientific innovation. It was also about like exploring the unknown. And the space race was a moment of incredible national pride. It was a moment that shaped humanity. Seeing a man on the moon was a mind-blowing. A lot of people say that was the most like shocking, exciting thing that they experienced in their life. They have memories of like watching it on TV still. And then the other thing about it was it had huge benefits because it spun off all these industries and science-based communities because the innovation was so radical. So I think creating a common purpose around something really profound and exciting that people can all get behind and work towards it is a source of shared pride. Another example is the Olympics. Olympics are great because you can test, your international dominance against other countries and other rivals, but it's always done in a peaceful way. That they have norms for the Olympics, like around Olympic spirit. And you'll see regularly during the Olympics, like some runner in the marathon like falls and injures themselves. Another runner picks them up and helps them. And it's really inspiring. We went through the previous century of multiple world wars that killed tens and tens of millions of people based on their national identities. And so international wars and deaths from wars have plummeted in the last 50 years. And we've built better institutions that have created a healthy mechanism for people to have a healthy sense of national pride and compete. And the Olympics maybe is like one of my favorite examples of that. And so that kind of gives me hope that we can always be getting better. We're not perfect. There are people being killed based on their national identities around the world right now. I don't want to diminish that, but I would just say if you take a minute, go to our world in data and look up the amount of people who died from intergroup conflict in the last several hundred years, or read Steven Pinker's book about how many people died in intergroup conflict.
Top 5 book in terms of how it's influenced the way I view the world.
It used to be the death from intergroup conflict for like prehistoric societies was like 1 in 10 people or something insane.
Yes.
And now it's like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 1,000 or something. Yeah. And so we've gotten way better. We found ways around it. We've used our big brains to find ways for international cooperation. We have institutions that try to make that better. World Bank, United Nations, all these things that are not perfect. They are deeply flawed, but nevertheless better than anything that we had before them for solving this problem.
How can people who disagree politically work more effectively together? And I mean work in the workplace, because politics has divided us at work as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I think that businesses and leaders are just starting to understand how corrosive this is to organizations. And I don't think they know how to deal with it. And I think that if you don't have a plan on it, it will sneak up to you on you in all kinds of bad ways. So I think that the first thing you have to understand is this is not going away. And that if you're any type of institution, it's happening at universities too. Polarization hits us and it's tearing us apart at universities. This last 6 months has seen that happen. And I'm at NYU, we have protests, we have divisions within our faculty, some half of which are voting, to non-confidence in our president and half of which are voting in confidence. And so hugely divisive at every level of the institution. So anyways, this isn't going away. So I think leaders need to have a philosophy of how they're going to manage it. I think I'll give you what this is for universities. The University of Chicago famously decided not to make statements on political issues many years ago. But most universities kept making statements. And then it became really divisive after October 7th about how to make statements, which statements to make. And then even when they would make them, often people would be pissed off. Either people felt excluded or the people you were trying to support didn't feel like your statement went strong enough. And so it created constant turmoil. And then there was more and more statements and no one ever seemed happy. And there's constant petitions pressuring people to make statements and protests pressuring people to make statements. And so they've just said, no more statements. And I think that actually is a really good model. And the model is not to get politics off the campus. The idea here is that, and I didn't agree with this at first, and I agree with it now. The idea here is to create a safe space for other people to have their own politics. And so the university saying, we're stepping back from it, but we're supporting your right to say whatever you want, believe whatever you want. But when the university makes statements, it implicitly alienates and ostracizes some people, excludes them, it's picking a side. And it's better. It also makes it unsafe for people to dissent. because then they feel have to go against the university president or the university administration.
Let's finish the conversation on the topic of dissent. People who are whistleblowers or dissenters, they're taking huge risks, but history may evaluate them differently. And in the book, you point out Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't know this, but I think his positive public rating was about a third of the American population. And then a few years ago, it was 95% of Americans saw him in a positive light. And so, maybe you could talk about the dissenters of today and the hurdles that they have to overcome, and then how history may view them in the future.
Yeah, that's a great, thanks for bringing up that example. It points to one thing. Dissent is hard. And when Martin Luther King was dissenting, he got assassinated. He paid with his life. He paid by going to prison repeatedly. And civil rights protesters were beat up. Dogs were sicked on them. It was one of the darkest moments of history. And in some sense, also one of the brightest, right? Because they were right. They saw an injustice. They put their lives on the line, and people eventually came around to it. Now, 95% of people, have positive attitudes of Martin Luther King. History is a little bit like that. Sometimes it's easy to look back in retrospect and see where things were wrong. In the moment, it's harder for people to know when they're wrong. And that's why you need to create a healthy environment for dissent, because you don't know where you're going wrong. And if you have a culture where people can't say so, you can go down some really terrible paths. But dissenters are really important for innovation. If you run a creative company, you need dissent, because you will stagnate and get really boring very fast. And so any creative field needs it. And I would argue almost any field needs healthy dissent. But it's hard to do, right? Because you don't want to get called a devil's advocate or a heretic. You don't want to get socially ostracized. We just talked about how our species hates that. So what you need to do is create a culture where it's normative and healthy to dissent. And I'll help you along the way. So this is Dominic, my co-author's research. Research shows that dissent predicts the outcome success of groups. So groups that don't have dissenters and people don't feel comfortable dissenting perform worse. There was a great study on Google Jigsaw. They analyzed other teams to find out what predicts successful teams. Single biggest factor was psychological safety, which is people feel comfortable speaking up and dissenting. That was more important than any personality trait or whether you go for beers after work or whatever. That's the culture you need. And then the next element of it is, as long as there's a dissenter in a group, the group reaches better outcomes, even if the dissenter is wrong. I always have to say this one twice. Groups make better decisions as long as there's a dissenter, even if the dissenter is wrong. Why? Because it frees up other people to dissent and creates a healthy conversation around whatever the topic is. And even if they weren't right about whatever the criticism is, someone else might have a better criticism or a better idea, and they're biting their tongue. That first speaker makes it safe for them to speak. And it creates group deliberation and discussion. And so you want desperately to create a community or a culture in any organization that allows and makes dissent healthy and safe.
I just wonder what you think happens to Liz Cheney in the future. Because she is the person I thought of when I read this part of your book is, wow, she really took a risk and she really cares. She cares. That's why she did it.
Yeah. So she was one of the main leaders of the Republican caucus. She was, by her voting record, one of the most conservative members of the party. And she spoke up because she saw the party going wrong. And so she cared deeply about the party, but she also did it because she cared deeply about the country. And she's willing to get kicked out of the party because she's terrified about what was happening for the country. And she paid the price. She lost her leadership role and then she got voted out. And so I think that's a symbol. I think history will look really fondly on Liz Cheney. I actually admire Republican dissenters a huge amount because how hard it is for them. And Mitt Romney. And they have described that they get death threats. It's hard for them to travel. It's hard for them to take public flights. And there's lots of people who kind of have privately said they would like to speak out, but can't for those reasons. And so I think that is something that takes enormous amount of courage and integrity. And hopefully history treats her well, because I think she has more courage than probably 99% of politicians.
Jay, I love the conversation. Thank you for your time and thank you for being a genius.
Thanks for having me.